Now I have to go back out. Just a second here. How do I do that? So we're going to be talking about the problem of why we don't know much about women's history and some of women's history. And I like this little cartoon, Adam and Eve, of course. There are certain things about history that are so much a part of our, lexicon that you know the stories, I presume. And this is the day the trouble started. And here we have a list. Please don't eat red meat, dairy products, sugar, apples. This is ridiculous. Why can't I eat apples? So when we think of Eve and we think of the apple, it was actually, I think, a pomegranate, but it doesn't matter. The point being that we know this story, right? We have all these stories, but the stories, just like the ones your parents told you, those stories mold who we are. And very often, now, are you back seeing each other?
Yes, we're back to full Zoom.
Excellent. Okie dokie. Well, then I'm going to share my screen again and show you. And I'm going to try moving on.
Good.
Oh, good. So this is women's history, and we're going to start out by talking about, I call it remembering women's history, because we've actually always had the history. However, I was well into my 40s and had been teaching for quite a long time before I began to get, of course, because of the current situation, right? The 70s and everything was, women were beginning to march. So thanks to the feminist movement, I began to think, wait a minute, where's my history? I started looking over all the education I'd had, and I realized I had absolutely no women's history. And people were saying, well, tell us about the women, and I couldn't. So I had to go back to school and take a quick class or two. And then basically I learned it the way you're going to learn it today. That is kind of, learn by doing. So I call us amnesia victims. We've been, all of us, men and women, think there's no women's history. When I first started my first class, which was Women in American History, I had colleagues who, without tongue in cheek, asked me what I was going to do after Betsy Ross. And that made me realize that they were woefully ignorant, even more ignorant than I was. But I couldn't tell very much, and I didn't have many smart answers because of, I didn't have the education myself. And so I got mad enough to go get it. And that led to a long period in my life, wonderful period of teaching women in American history. And then eventually they kept saying to me, my students, of course, have been my biggest teachers, and they kept saying to me, well, why did they bring this with their Bibles and their pillows to America? And that's how I got into teaching women in Western Civ, trying to answer these questions. So there are going to be some themes throughout this course. And one of them is oneness versus dualism. And, it's a basic philosophical theme. Are we all one? Are we really all one people? When we say Black Lives Matter today, some people say all lives matter, and we castigate them. And that actually shows the problem exactly as it is. And that is that if you really believe in oneness, it is true that all lives matter. And then the problem being, though, that the Blacks have not been included, right, in the same way. We haven't had the same opportunities. And that's the dualism. That's the, one up. And that's a basic philosophical issue that we're going to always have to deal with. Of course, another is might makes right, power. Who has the power, and do they have the power to define us? And then there is the paradox. And that's one of the things we have to hold, which is kind of like being both one and dualistic. It's kind of a paradox. We have to hold it in one time, one place together, and that's kind of hard to do. Okay, speaking of oneness versus dualism, I think that what that really does, those concepts mimic human consciousness development. So the baby is one with the mother, and there's no differentiation. But as soon as it's born, it discovers slowly, not immediately, as we all know who've had babies, the body and a separation of self, and it scares it half to death. It's very upset about that. And therefore we have the birth of love and fear. That's the paradox, right? We want to be independent, but we don't like being lonely, right? We don't like being dependent or vulnerable, but we can't be close to one another without being that. And so human history is the story of the consciousness of the social animal. Man and woman, according to Marx and Engels, and probably many folks well before them that we never heard about, pointed out that the very first division of labor was between man and woman, or the first recognition of other is between man and woman. In fact, it's usually the first label that we have. And I was given that consciousness kind of whap in the face when I had my son. I gave birth to my son. In those days, we didn't peak. And out he came, but and the doctor grabbed him and they whisked him away. And I said, "What is it?" And the nurse said, "It's a baby." And I went, "Well, yeah, but is it a boy?" "Oh, it's a little baby boy. Congratulations." So right there, that's the first label. What is it? It's a baby, right? No, it's a boy or a girl. It's a human. And then we have, of course, this lonely situation of being conscious of ourselves, very vulnerable, a baby boy or girl in the world. And how are we going to stand that? It's hard. So consciousness, which is our gift, just a second, I'm going to have to silence this. The consciousness that is the very gift of being human is also a painful consciousness, I think. And that's because we are made conscious of the fact of our lives that they are mortal. And most children, I think the psychologists say, really kind of come aware of death somewhere around 5 or 6. So maybe for a little blissful time, we get to not be aware of that, especially if we have a comfortable, happy family. But in fact, being conscious that we are mortal, I think, is very, very painful. And therefore we create God, or God is already there to hold our hands. However you take that, that's why we must deal with a question of God, because of the issues of power. Physical life is life and death. And that means, for some of us at least, that we deal with that by trying to be on top of it, be the most alive, might makes right. Intellectual life is based on knowledge and secrets. There's religion and history, which of course is written by the victors. Those who aren't victors, in many cases, if there's a war on, weren't around to tell the story. We have oral traditions, and we create symbols and pictures, all ways to try to deal with our mortality, our vulnerability, our humanness. And we also become very creative, and that allows us a little teeny bit of being godlike and powerful. Now, what about that paradox? What's that got to do with anything? Well, the paradox is from the dualism. I have this problem all the time. Is it this or is it that, right? Is it men's fault or is it women's fault? Or is it nobody's fault? Is it nature or is it nurture? And are we body or are we spirit? Is it good or bad? And we are always judging, right? We try to judge. And of course, sometimes you have to judge. Is it good or bad that tiger is charging at me? How do I deal with that, right, in order to stay alive? So staying alive becomes rather important to us. And this is what we are given to do, is hold that hard paradox. The answer is yes. And I don't know about you, but throughout my long life, I have found more and more and more that whenever I say, is it this or is it that? The answer is almost always, it's both this and that. And now what do I do with that? How do we do both at once? The problem of time and space and being mortal is trying to understand ourselves and life, and the source of the whole life is human history. And part of what we do to try to deal with this is to try to understand and in many cases try to control our history. So it's this and that. It's both men and women. And without that, the reason we need women's history, all of us, men and women, is because otherwise the story is always incomplete. If you take half the human race and you just leave them out of the story, then it's incomplete or distorted. If you have one half of the human race defining the other half of the human race, then it can be distorted. So that's why we need it all. All right, there it goes. And that's why, here's my pitch, we all need human and women's history. In order to have human history, we need human history, okay? And in order to understand anything, we have to divvy it up. That's why, and today we really experience that, right? Everybody's a real expert in one little thing and not in the whole thing. But we divide up life in order to make it possible to understand and to function. And how did we divide it originally? We divided the basic structure, of course, into those who are most close to us. And then we move out from there, from the family to the tribe, to the village, and eventually to the state. And the further out we move, the more complex it becomes, more frustrating, and the more we tend to, try to just tell part of it. One of those ways we divide it is through religions, because in the agony of being conscious, almost all societies develop some sort of religion. It's hard being consciously mortal. If you look out at the stars, it's beautiful. It's also awe-inspiring. And I don't know about you, but just even looking out at the ocean, I find myself to be very little. And when I'm very little, interestingly, sometimes that's a relief, because I tend to be over-responsible and think I should be in charge of a whole lot more than I am. But I need help, and I don't want to be alone. But when I start looking for help, I end up having to have relationships with other people. And that leads to social control and or ethics at the larger level. Come on, where's my little ball? There we go. Thank you. So of course we discover knowledge is power. If you know something somebody else doesn't know and you keep it a secret, you have some power over them. Now, on the other hand, if you know something other people don't know and you keep it a secret, we don't get to pass on our hard-won experience. So everybody has to start over. So teaching ourselves to think beyond the present is also one of the reasons for history, and writing it down for humans that we never know is a uniquely human characteristic. Oops, wait a minute, I'm ahead of myself. Stop that. Oh, I'm sorry, there we go. Let me go back here. Okay, so I want to read you, we're going to look at discovering the Great Mother today, and the goddess of life, death, life, and that's the cycle, that's the, you might say, the basis upon which people are dealing, right? I'm alive, then I know I'm going to be dead, then maybe there's a life after that. And so that's the basis of religion. And in the Upper Paleolithic, this is what happened to me. Okay, I graduated from college basically, and what expertise I had was all in modern Germany. So that, by the time I started to try and teach survey courses, even, Western Civ, the general Western Civ, I was way out of my depth, and I've spent my life out of my depth, in academia at least. But I also find that when we have the multicultural or group archaeology, mythology, art, history does encompass them all. It's just that you have to skip along pretty fast. And that's what we're going to be doing today. So we're going to look at the Upper Paleolithic from about 35,000 BC to 7,000 BC. That's where I ended up when I said, well, where did women's history start? So I got catapulted deeply back in far, far out of my range. Joseph Campbell in The Maps of God said, there can be no doubt that in the very earliest ages of human history, the magical force and the wonder of the female was no less a marvel than the universe itself. And this gave to women a prodigious power, which has been one of the chief concerns of the masculine part of the population to break, control, and employ to its own ends. It is, in fact, most remarkable how many primitive hunting races have a legend of a still more primitive age than their own, in which the women were the sole possessors of the magical earth and magical arts. They knew something, right? They knew something other people didn't know. And from that developed the mythologies of Mother Earth, Gaia, Mother Nature, the life source, and how do we know it is actually goddesses we're looking at when we see the ancient stuff. They didn't leave records, and even if they did, we couldn't read them. And even if we can read them, we often don't understand them, which is one of the problems. Even good writing can leave us doing a whole lot of interpreting. So someone once said, history is bunk, and someone else, that. But in fact, it is in a sense, because it is an interpretation, right? It is based on facts. It is a little different than literature in the way it tries to get at the truth, but in fact, it is always an interpretation. So today, you're going to get my interpretation of history, looking through the woman's lens. For some reason, I'm having trouble with my little cursor staying in one place here. Okay, so we're going back in time here. How do we know if we find a bunch of goddesses, or we say it's a bunch of goddesses, that we're looking at goddesses? And the truth is, we don't know, right? We can't really be sure. They don't speak, and we don't have, the written record. But if we go back far into this time, and we look at the ancient Near East and Egypt, which is what we're going to look at today, and we will be running around about 25,000 BCE to about 1500 BCE. And I don't know about you, but when I was in college and I took ancient history, it began with the Greeks. It began somehow and that was about 400 BC, which seemed very old to me, but it really wasn't. When I went to the age of the Great Mother, I had to go a lot further back. So we're going to the ancient Near East. We're going to Jericho, which is about 8,000 BCE. Most of the figures there that they found when they dug up Jericho were what we call small mother goddesses. Okay, and we're going to CatalHeuyeuk. Oops, sorry. Come on, little arrow. Sorry, I'm going backwards. Which is in Anatolia. Here I am. You see me? I'm pointing at this map. It doesn't work, does it? Sorry. Anyway, and we find in CatalHeuyeuk, which is about 6,500 BCE, that it was 3 times as large as Jericho. We know about Joshua at the Battle of Jericho because of the Hebrews. But there were over 40 shrines excavated of goddesses, and we call in her 3 aspects. So when we talk about the goddess, the 3 aspects are maiden, mother, and crone, right? So the wise woman being the old woman, the mother, of course, the great fertility body, and the maiden, the one that we fall in love with. We know most of them that the bodies they discovered, which were covered with red ochre, which is generally indicating sacred, were nearly all women. We know that some archaeologists still are stubbornly looking for the king, but they haven't found him yet. And until they do, we're going to assume that, I'm going to assume, and you can make your own assumption, that the goddess, all those females who were, put on large platforms, the children buried with them on large permanent platforms, the males in small movable beds, that's because they must have been significant, even though that counters against what we have learned in most of our history before. Okay, and with that, I am going to try to stop my share. And I see you all, right?
Yes, yes.
Do you have any questions before I move on to the next little piece? Okay, well then I'm going to go
see.
back. And I'm going to share the screen. And I'm going to take this one. And I'm going to share, oops, where'd it go? What are you seeing on your screen now?
Right, hit the little icon.
Oh, it's not, oh, okay, I gotta get out of here. Okay, wait, I can't, I have no little icon, that's the problem. Just a second here, I'm trying this again. Okay, I want to share my screen, and I want to go over. No. Help, Harry. Escape, that's it. Ah, yes, escape. Okay. Okay, let's see. All right, now, if I share my screen, oh, I know, I need to get out of the whole escape. Okay, I'm out of the whole thing. So if I share my screen and I pick this one and I share it.
Oh.
Now what are you seeing?
Yeah, we see it. You just need to hit the little icon to make it full screen. Right. Good.
How's that?
Perfect.
Okay. Except that's not where I want to be. Oh, no, 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 no. Sorry. I don't know how I got there, but anyway, here we are. So we're going to look at the images and the symbols of the goddess here, of the women in the ancient Near East. And once again, we see Natasha Kinsky here, and the connection between women and snakes, in spite of the fact that I know lots of women who just shudder at that thought, but the fact is that women and snakes connection goes way back. And of course, then here we have also the connection between love and sex, and sexual love and beauty and all that. That also goes way back. Now this, of course, is from the Renaissance, but this is a Venus, right? Some people call her Venus on the half shell, Venus on the clam shell. And that is, again, an old myth. In fact, when we look at most of the pictures, here are the Cycladic art. This is, you can see, this is clearly a female. She has the pubic triangle in the breasts. And this one goes back to about 3500 BC. There are all kinds of, and I'm not going to give you the dates on all of them, but here is, the goddess with the many-breasted goddess, right? Because part of what the goddess stood for was fertility, fecundity, and of course, hopefully, more food around so that we could all live for a while. So the nourishing mother is a major image in our society. Here again, these are from all over the ancient Near East and Egypt, as you can see. Here, we'll get to Crete later, but this is not meant to be pornographic, folks. This is the fertile, nurturing mother. And look at her, she's got a cat on her head and she's holding snakes. The bare-breasted, wasp-waisted maiden, full of fertility. This one is Stone Age. India, Greece. Very symbolic. They found thousands and thousands of these in tombs. And for this one, very obvious, the Venus of Willendorf, 30,000 years ago. Again, you can see clearly that the breasts, right? The big breasts, the big belly, this is fertility, right? This is a well-fed woman. I haven't got my numbers on here. Ah, and the rabbit. Of course, what do we all know about rabbits? We got a phrase about that, right? They breed like rabbits. Means they got very fertile, right? They're very fertile. They can keep, okay. And this one is needs a little more explication, but when I held up I'll get to this more specifically in Crete, but when I held up the double-headed axe, that is associated in the ancient world with the labyrinth. And the moon, you know, the new moon and the old moon was the way they measured time and the way they saw, you know, fertility coming in. So the night of the moon was tremendously significant to them. I'm going to stop my share here for just a minute. Hi. Oh, doggone it. I have to be careful what I hit. There's my stop. Escape. Ah, hallelujah. Okay, any questions so far about these different symbols or pictures? Do they evoke anything in any of you? No? Okay. Well, then I'm going to go on. And I'm going to share that screen again. New share. Okay, now what are you seeing?
We're seeing both of your
Both
two.
of them. Okay. Well, I want to pick this one. No. So if I pick this full screen, you don't.
Yep.
Oh, now you got it. Okay. Got to learn to hit it a little longer. Okay. All right. So in the ancient Near East, there were two major symbols and rituals of the goddess. One was the sacred marriage, and one was the dying god. And in the sacred marriage, they literally had huge festivals. Some people call them orgies today, but that's not what they were then. They were the huge sacred festival of marriage, in which the high priestess and the priest would enact the great fertility symbol. And she was the chalice. So you can see here on this picture, a chalice, right? And the snake was a symbol of fertility. Again, though, both of these are goddesses, but you can imagine who the snake was, right? So here's the snake pointing straight into the chalice, the mother and the father, right? The combination of the two. A lot of goddess symbols are of yonis. And they, again, this was not pornography in those days. This was sacred. This was the center of life, death, life of the great mother. The pubic triangle, of course. Lots of triangular symbols. And the dying god. Well, this will be, when we get to Crete, we'll see this labrys again. This is called a labrys, and it is obviously a double-headed axe. And when they dug up Crete, they found huge double-headed axes like this. Only they were, if they were meant to cut off someone's head, they wouldn't have been possible at all, because they were, you know, like 6 feet across. Okay, so they were symbols of, but they were goddess symbols, considered the symbol of the goddess. Okay. Let's see. Trouble is, the reason I'm having a little difficulty is that I have when I have them up here like this, I can't see the numbers I have on them. Let me see if I can just, I want to share my screen, but more of it. Okay. What are you seeing now?
We're back to the Zoom gallery view.
The gallery view. Okay, so you're not seeing the,
No.
I wonder if I can, let me see if I can then share this in such a way that you get, no. Oh, well, okay. I'm just going to guess here exactly where I ought to be in my slides. Sorry. So the ritual of the goddess was the sacred marriage. This was a yearly ritual. It was enacted to provide plenty and for fecundity, right, fertility. It was often acted out by a priest and consort, sex being very sacred, and then it was accompanied by lots of feasting and rejoicing, and sometimes by lots of copulating. And that was the example. An example of this is the courtship of Inanna and Dumuzi in Sumer. Okay, I don't really want to be looking at that particular one. So let's go back here to that one. Okay. Here, say is Inanna speaking. My vulva, the horn, the boat of heaven, is full of eagerness like the young moon. Go back one more. My untilled land lies fallow. As for me, Inanna, who will plow my vulva? Who will plow my high field? Who will plow my wet ground? As for me, the young woman, who will plow my vulva? Who will station the ox there? Who will plow my vulva? And Dumuzi answers, great lady, the king will plow your vulva. I, Dumuzi, the king, will plow your vulva. Inanna, then plow my vulva, man of my heart. Plow my vulva. And we, of course, have all kinds of images of vulvas and triangle and pubic triangles and the snake. Okay. So the attitude towards sex was clearly positive and often enthusiastic. It was holy. We still talk about holy matrimony, but we have a whole other bunch of attitudes toward this, which are sometimes a little hard to overcome when you start looking at the really ancient rituals. And what would happen a lot in Sumer and in other places like Babylon and such was that when they would have this yearly ceremony, you would have literally, you know, the king and the priestess or whoever it was as kings evolved. Okay, in the beginning, the king was actually the dying god. So it was kind of a dangerous situation to be in, to plow the Inanna's vulva. Because afterwards would come the sacrificial king, right? The dying king. So the sacrifice of the dying king, the joint ritual that went with this, was often also acted out literally, right? In some of these societies. And the idea was that you have to, it was an agrarian society, right, developing, and so there was hunting and gathering, but there was also the feeling of sacrifice. You have to give back in order to get it to keep going. So the sacrifice was a guarantee of plenty for all, and it was holy, and it was considered, of course, the best thing you could possibly do. So the original dying king was the best young man in the village, if you will, or the best young man who could stand in for, well, originally it was the king. He would be the king, maybe king for a year. It was called the year king. And then at the end of that, he would plow the vulva of the goddess, and then he would be sacrificed. So the death of the king was seen as offering the very best that you had, right, to the goddess. And we still see little remnants of that, like in Christianity, the sacrificial lamb, you know, so over time, guys discovered this wasn't such a really good deal, and so they tried to evolve the rituals a little bit. And first went, of course, to symbolic rituals, the best bull, the best ram, whatever. But it mimics the seasons and sex, birth, death, and rebirth. Okay, so here we have these symbols of the goddess, and among them, now why the snake? The snake sheds its skin. It's reborn over and over again. And also it has the power of death. Many of the snakes, not all of them, but certainly many of still today, but in the ancient world, the cobra, snake, the asp that Cleopatra killed herself with. They also believe, some people believe, that priestesses could be inoculated, and if, in other words, get like we do today, we're talking about that a lot these days, right? Have a little vaccine, get a little inoculation, and so if they got a little bit of inoculation, they could often handle snakes with impunity, right? They could not be killed by the venom, and this was a great way to wow the crowd, right? And to make them say, "Wow, you are really special. You are must be an incarnation of the goddess." So, and also you will see it as a sign for medicine, you know, the caduceus with the snakes entwining there. And of course, in Medusa's hair. Medusa, we see her, again, it's been turned negative, which I'll talk about symbol reversal later. But in the beginning, the early idea of the snake-headed woman was that she was the goddess, right? She was this powerful woman with a mane, you might say, of snakes. Okay. And in the East and in other places, one of the mythical creatures that stood in for the snake was the dragon queen. And so the dragon is also one of the symbols. Then, of course, we have the tree of life. Now, the tree of life was nourishment. The tree of life was ever growing, right? Going on. It was the goddess's tree. And in early times, women and men worshipped in groves. It was symbol of the above and below. You know, the tree has as much growing under the ground as it does above the ground. And people very, very early on were very conscious of the notion that, you know, we live above the ground, but when we die, you know, we end up below the ground or returning ashes to ashes, dust to dust. All those ideas were existent very, very early in society, thousands of years ago. And of course, where is it here? We have the fruit of the tree. And the fruit is not only good to eat, but it provides sustenance, and it's a great symbol for the great mother goddess. The apple, the fig, and the pomegranate. We have it left over today in this little beautiful children's story, The Giving Tree, how humans were literally sustained by this tree of life. We also have swirls, sort of like labyrinths in miniature. Eggs, goddesses. This is one in the Egyptian. Okay, I'm going to go back here because I want to switch to Egypt. I think, okay, we're in pretty good shape. Let me get back out of here. I'm going to escape. And I'm going to go, hopefully, to you. Can I see you? Here we go. Okay. Oh.
Well, we're seeing, you're still in screen share with your 2 PowerPoints.
Trying to escape. Goodness. Are you here?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So, I'd like to stop here for a few minutes and see if any of you have any commentary on this, or if it's stimulating any thoughts or ideas, or you have any questions. Are you familiar with all these symbols? I mean, do you know them as goddess symbols?
Well, let me ask one, Gail.
Yeah.
Well,
Constantine
are you
talking.
Oh, okay. And then I think Constantine,
Oh, you have to unmute.
you were asking yourself, you have to unmute yourself. But so what you're showing us, was this a particular culture? I assume this is all based on archaeology, et cetera.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
so in the whole Near East here, to what extent was there kind of uniform underlying belief system, or did it vary a lot? And this is a kind of particular version of it.
I think that it was pretty widespread because the pictures I'm showing you, the goddess symbols and everything, are from all over the Near East. Now, most of them are like from Sumer and from Ur, and also, but you also find them among the pre-literate folks, or at least the people who don't bury their items, you know, with any kind of written. It's all, it's not written It's almost all of it's not written. And the mother, we're talking about 25,000 years of old Europe and old, and Anatolia, Turkey, what is today Turkey, etc. So those, and then Crete, and when we get to Egypt, we'll see it in Egypt too. So in all those pre-time, we're talking about 2000 BC to maybe 25,000 BC, is almost, not exclusively, but primarily goddess dominated.
Okay. I see in the...
Are there any parallels to this hemisphere?
Oh, yes. If you go far enough back in China and Japan,
No, I mean here.
Oh, here.
In the Western Hemisphere.
Good question. Let me see. What do I know about the American past? Part of the problem with that is that I haven't studied Native history. And so I don't know completely. I know we have this, when we talk about the dying king, right, and the sacrificial rituals, we know we had those in the Aztecs and the Incas societies. So they had that, but and they had goddesses as well as gods. Polytheism was far more common. And that's another issue I think that's important, is that polytheism is actually a type of religious spirituality that is far more open to all different kinds of peoples and representations than monotheism. So once the monotheists come, but the people, certainly all the people who came here from Europe, brought the fully developed patriarchy with them. They had no knowledge of this stuff, the Puritans, the early. So, but that would be a great area to study, is the early Native Americans. But I don't know the answer.
Right.
Yeah.
Questions on the chat is from Irene. When did men take over?
Again, it depends on when you're talking about, but we find that transition from goddess to god kind of goes in where we tend to call civilization, right? The development of civilization. What happened was that when you have the dying king and then you also began to have groups, bumping into each other and trying for dominance. The dying king managed to morph himself into the heroic fighter king. And so with the advent of more warfare, not little tribal warfare, but big warfare, we do find that. And so in terms of timing, let's see, that would be, well, let's see, the Egyptians have still got the goddess. I'll get to that. The Cretans, so we're 3000 BC. Prior to that, Babylon's Assyria movement. The more warlike the society becomes, the more important the warrior king becomes, until pretty soon you have a flip to a more patriarchal society. It happens over a couple thousand years, not instantly.
What about the Minoans?
I'm going to get to them in the next hour. The Egyptians and Minoans are coming up.
Yeah, that symbol that you showed, which had a labyrinth in the center and two crescent moons.
Right.
Could you explain that? This is a J.A. Romanoff, Alexandra. Could you explain how the labyrinth got into it?
Good question. How did the labyrinth get in it? We know we have that by Crete, and Crete is still in the Minoan era, so it's already there. I'm not sure. Let me see if it comes to me as we're going along. I know that the journey, the labyrinth represents the journey, and it can be the spiritual journey or the. Might have to get back to you on that.
That is a Minoan symbol, that particular labyrinth.
Yes.
That you
Well, yeah, the labyrinth is already there, and it is a Minoan symbol, and it of course gets we get it from the later groups who are already, patriarchal, so that the labyrinth and the bull, the minotaur. Well, let me get to that when we get to Crete, okay? And then you can ask me some more after we've taken a look at Crete, okay?
Thank you.
Other questions?
Did all people in a village participate in these ceremonies, or were there class differences and slaves and so forth who wouldn't be involved in the ceremony?
Well, the temple, if you will, that comes in when we start talking about the religious aspect, not all people, it was led by the upper class, the priestesses. So the first incarnation, if you will, of organization is not political, it's religious, right? So the temple is there. And so the temple and the ceremony would have been led by the priestesses who were and the priest or the god king, depending on where in history you are, and they led it. But in most that we know of the societies, it was a huge festival, so everybody would have gone, and then in some of the ones that we do know about, the festival included mass copulation. In other words, it was a time when everybody imitated the goddess and god in order to provide for this great fertility in the village. So yes, people participated, but were there higher ups? Yeah, there was, with the development of the temple, or not always the temple, it might just be the village center, etc. But as that developed, then you develop people who spend all their whole lives as learning the lore, the secrets, the mysteries, and they would have been the elite of the group. And so they were leaders, yeah. And then the development of priesthood and kingship comes along, evolves, right, from that position. Does that make sense? Okay.
Gunther had a question.
Yeah, Gunther, what? I don't see him, but.
Unmute yourself.
Well, as we know at the moment, the cradle of humankind is in the Ethiopia-Somalia area. And if you look earlier, 25,000 years ago, are there any signs of symbols of feminism out of that geographic area?
Well, I don't know much of anything about African history except, right around the edge, the Mediterranean edge. But there definitely is in the African, like in Morocco, ran into all kinds of goddess symbols that they still have going there. But I don't know about the rituals, the particular rituals that I know of from Sumer and Ur and Babylon, etc. So I can only half answer your question. Was the goddess there? Clearly she was, at least in Northern Africa. And my guess is that maybe elsewhere, right, in the areas. But I don't know enough African history to answer that. Okay. Do you need a little break? A quick pee break? Tell you what, I need a pee break. I'll give 5 minutes and then we'll be back and we will go on to Egypt and Crete. Okay? Okay. You can talk if among yourself, unmute yourselves and talk.
No. Now I see Adele Shidiak has joined us. Adele, can you unmute yourself?
No.
No. Okay.
Okay.
Oh, Adele,
I'm on.
Can you tell me what? I could see that you had trouble getting in, and I didn't know how to let you in. So can you tell me what happened with it?
Was that the one that was like 15 minutes before it started? That one?
Oh, that's possible, you know.
Because I went on and then I got off, and then I came back on, like right before it started. So I'm fine.
Oh, okay,
But
okay.
that might have been what you were looking at. But I've been on since it started.
All right. Well, thanks. That probably does explain it.
Yeah, thanks for your call. I appreciate that.
Okay. Okay. All right. He has a blank. Okay. Other messages.
Barry,
Yes.
I'll mention that people can put their pictures off. In some ways, I think it's better if we don't have everybody's picture on while Gail is talking. It's up to you, but
Well, when she's talking, when she's doing the screen share, you know, the picture is on the right-hand side. You control that. Each of us.
right.
Yeah,
That's what I'm
the
saying.
little. But I mean, if somebody else has all their pictures showing during the slideshow, we don't see what they see.
Uh-huh. The
Lois,
rest
do you
of us do.
know how to do it? Because that's something I would like to know, how to remove people's pictures when there's a screen share. Because it's often blocking some of the lettering on the screen share. I'd like to be able to cut it out completely.
Okay, so at the top of the list of pictures, there's a little black bar, and to the left of that black bar, you can't see it right now. There are 3 rectangles, a double one, a single one, and a little one. And basically, one of them allows you to see multiple pictures. The middle one usually just is the speaker, and then the third one you only see the little black bar. So if you want to get that out of, often a good way to set it is pick the middle symbol, and that allows you to see the speaker. And even that, you could move it halfway off the screen, so it doesn't obstruct much of any of the screen.
Yeah, because it's irritating. I'm constantly moving it from one side to the other, trying to see the lettering because of the way the screen's set up.
Yeah, just experiment with those little symbols on the black bar right on top of the pictures.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I prefer to know, because I don't like experimenting, because then I lose things and have 5 minutes.
I know that feeling. I'm always afraid I don't get what I intend to get at all.
Yeah. Gail, one thing you brought up here is this whole idea of human sacrifice. That has always been a mystery to me. That seems such an extreme thing for cultures to adopt, and it just, in some ways, just has never made sense.
Well, I understand. I mean, it's in our modern world, of course, it sounds pretty horrible, but if you think about the notion of the life, death, life being the sacred mother, you know, the whole thing. Mm-hmm. And you think about the fact that in order for life to go on, you have to have this reproduction, and then there's this dying, the dying king or the dying god, right? Or the, actually sexually, remember it's part of a sexual ritual. Sexually, often, in fact, they'll talk about, you know, after intercourse, the little dying god of the penis, you know, down it goes. And so the male is essential, but not like the female is in this thinking. Mm. Female is the very mother and the productive, you know, order of things. Now, men tried to kind of co-opt that. Actually, Aristotle thought that people just men deposited a little whole thing, right? A little homunculus in the female. So as it evolved, but I think that it had to do with trying to guarantee the ongoingness of life by giving the best. And if you think of the ram without any problem, right? The perfect ram, which later became the sacrifice as they evolved it from human sacrifice. But it starts with the male and the female, and the male literally, and we're still asking that of men in a way, right? That you'll lay down your life in the army for the good of the whole. So that which you can give is the very best you can give is your life. And also women, of course, were giving their lives in childbirth all the time. And so, it was then as now, but particularly then it was right in front of you, right? Lives were short. They lived maybe 30 years. Can you unmute yourself, Constantine? You need to unmute yourself. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Mary Jean. I can hear you. There.
Also, I would add, my understanding is it was a sacred sacrifice.
It was.
And it was an absolute honor to be able to give the ultimate so that the rest survives, or so there's great growth that you're giving to the people you leave behind. Part of it was that it was an
That's right, and we do that. We call them heroes, today. And when men sacrifice themselves for the good of the whole, and it was. So at least that's how they cast it, and that's how they believed it. Constantine.
Well, one of the things I think as a theory is that when we observe nature, we observe, for instance, on a tree where there's fruit, which is the birth. And then we observe it going into the ground and dissolving or dying. And from the ground from which it dies comes again birth. That might be one theory, that when people in the past observed nature literally, that's where it comes from. That dying creates life. That's just
Absolutely.
a theory.
I agree with you. And it's also the basic cycle of life, right? Life, death,
right.
Rebirth, and all religions practically are dealing with that, as far as I can tell. And so it's and then consciousness. The difference between humans, maybe we don't know what, other animals think, but is that we are conscious of our looming death, right? It may not be, we're trying to put it off or whatever, and certainly in early times, it was much more immediate and shorter, etc. But this is the problem of consciousness, right? I know I'm going to die. I don't want to die. Well, you can run away from it or you can run to it, but you're going to die. And I think that a great deal of all that we've created and all these things has been trying to cope with this consciousness. And some ways of doing that is say, well, I'm going to live my life for something that matters. And if that means I have to die, then so be it. Louise. Yeah.
Hi, I'm enjoying this. Thank you. As I say, when we visited the Marquesa Islands, one of the islands had a ritual place for human sacrifice. And I asked about the honor of it, and the lady looked at me and laughed, and she said, certainly not. Nobody wants to be honored in this way. It was not an honor, it was the enemy.
Well, it certainly is the enemy of whoever is chosen. And so, but we choose people to die all the time.
Yeah.
We're facing some of that today, You're not maybe choosing people to die, but you're saying, well, how much can we do, right, to put off this death? It's the human condition.
Yeah.
By the way, I wanted to show you some. Let's see. Here we go. I want to get it in a place where you can see it. Can you see this item here?
Triangle.
Yeah. You see that? I'm trying to get it so it shows. Can you see all of it? This is
Yes.
This is in answer to Gunther, you know. This is from Morocco. It's modern, but it's copying the ancient Moroccan. It's a triangle with triangles with a hole in the center and a half moon, the open moon.
Mhm.
This is a symbol still. You'll find it all over Morocco. I bought it because I thought it was beautiful, but also because they talked a lot about the goddess when I was in Morocco. Because our guide was a Berber, and their society still worships the goddess.
Can you hold it
So-
right in front of your camera?
Where is my camera? I would
Probably
like
It's a little green light at the top.
Right. That's close.
Okay, wait, just a second. I'm working on it. Here,
Yeah.
And then
get my
maybe,
head out of the way.
and then put something dark behind it.
Good idea. Just a second. Hang on. This is doable. Here.
There you go. That's,
Oh, that's terrific.
that's good.
Beautiful.
Perfect. Right there. Okay.
Hey.
Very good. Yes.
So again, I say I don't know much about African history, and but of course in European history, North Africa was very much a part of it, and we're gonna, we will trade in Egypt, for instance, and such. But in the center of Africa, I have zero understanding. But my guess is, if you look closely, you would still find the mother goddess because she's so primal to our.
And going back to the question about the West and the Americas, I just went into my photos for my visit to the fantastic museum in Mexico City and pulled up 3 images immediately of the Mother Goddess. If I could share screen, I could show you these just now because I've got them up on my desktop. But just they look just like the image that you showed at the beginning. And I'm not sure of what AC and DC are in terms of looking at the plaques that were with them. Because one seemed earlier than the others, but they both seem to be within a few hundred years AC/DC. So around that time, the images that were coming from some of the civilizations in the Americas. But I recommend, if you ever get a chance, go to that museum in Mexico City. It's the most fantastic anthropological museum I've ever seen. Really great.
Fantastic, Irene. Thank you. You know what I meant to say, and I didn't somewhere along there, is part of what happens when I look at women's history is that areas of seeing open up. We see the world not as it is, but as we are. And as we expand our notion of who we are, we see things that were right there all along that we didn't know what we were looking at. You know what I mean? I'm sure you've all had that experience of, suddenly seeing something or reading something a second time, after you've had a education that you didn't have before. So that's why it's so important that we keep expanding our understanding. Yeah, I think you'd find it everywhere. As I said, I was clear through grad school and had not even any consciousness. The biggest thing of looking for women's history. And it took the rising consciousness of the 70s to make me even look. But then it was pretty exciting once I discovered it. So
I have something to recommend. I've been studying this subject since the 1970s. And around that period, Marija Gimbutas,
oh yes,
the archaeologists started writing books on the gods and goddesses of old Europe, and the book that I have in my hand is her book, The Language of the Goddess, and it basically gives the symbols. I don't know if you're familiar with this book, Gail, but it gives the symbols and explains them not just in a word or two, but in a chapter for each symbol.
I am, in fact, of that. Yes, that was one of the things I came upon when I started, working in this interesting area.
Yeah.
Are you holding that book up? I can't see where you are.
Yeah, I have.
Who's talking?
This is Alexandra Romanov. I'm the one with the Earth symbol.
Oh, yes. Oh, okay.
J.A.
Yes,
Yeah.
J.A.
So,
Hi.
yeah, it's an excellent book. Anything by Marija Gimbutas. Really, she was the person, the first archaeologist to unearth much of what you're telling us right now.
Yes, she was. That's how I'm just looking for a second. I thought I had her book too. Maybe I can show it to you here in a second.
That's it. That's the book I have in my hand.
Yep. Marija Gimbutas gave a lot, and it's got lots of the pictures and things and explanations. Goes way deeper, of course, than what I'm able to do in this class, but just to look for this kind of stuff, and it's full of wonderful pictures.
And then you mentioned Joseph Campbell. You mentioned Joseph Campbell, who wrote the foreword, and he gives a lot of psychological explanation behind these goddesses in his own books.
Right. Yeah, Campbell did wonderful. Well, the mythology, you know, digging into the mythology. And also Rianne Eisler. If you haven't read Rianne Eisler, she has done a wonderful job, but it's modern, you know, kind of explicating of just this basic stuff I'm giving you. But it's, if it interests you, that's another wonderful teacher.
Oh, so is it Joanne Romanoff?
Alexandra. Hi, Barry.
So Alexandra, it's interesting. What's coming through in your video is your virtual background, but then I think where your face is just all broken up. I don't know if other people are seeing it or if it's just my screen.
That's what I'm seeing too. You look like a cosmic movement against the earth.
Exactly. It's like some astronomical
camera thing there.
So somehow your camera is not dealing with your virtual background.
Yeah, let's put it back. There you go. Now you are.
Oh, there you are. Yeah.
Right, same thing. Now it goes that way.
Yep.
Yeah.
Good.
Nice to see you.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. I like that background too, but usually my face shows, although my face goes in and out in space, so it might be that you weren't close enough. Okay, shall we move on to Egypt?
Can I just say one thing about Barry's question? So the idea of human sacrifice was a lot easier in an era before there was any concept of the value of the individual or rights of the individual. People belonged to their families, they belonged to their parents. The thing is that the idea of the individual, the value of each individual, the rights of individuals, by the time those concepts developed, there was already such a stratification of society that they were used to oppress the people who didn't have them.
Sure.
Not human rights, and they still aren't. So that's what made human sacrifice so much easier.
Yeah.
Okay. Nice to see you all. Let's go on a little bit. I'm going to see if I can escape. Yes. And go to Egypt. Yeah. And what I want to do, I want to share my screen, and I'm going to Egypt. Okay. What are you seeing?
We see your PowerPoint. You just need to hit the little icon there for full screen.
Just a minute here. Okay, I'm going to hit this.
No, bottom left.
It doesn't have it. There we go. How's that?
Good.
Oh, good. Okay. So now we're going to move on to Egypt. And Egypt was a place where the geography, well, this is true of all places, of course, but Egypt, you can really see how the geography affected the society. And so, you know, this is called Lower Egypt, which is strange. What?
Oh, somebody's talking in the background here. See that? Go ahead, Gail.
Okay, so here again, I'm trying to walk around with my little cursor. You can't see my cursor, can you?
Yes.
You can.
You can. Oh, goody. Okay.
You can use it as a pointer.
I can use it as a pointer. Okay, so so the river, of course, the great Nile River, and the reason this is called Lower Egypt is because that's the direction that the Nile flows. Right? It goes. So geography really contributed, I think, and to some extent, the people, of course, to a very long, very stable, very conservative, and very rich life in Egypt. The river, you know, flowed. They didn't have dams in there, and it flooded its banks every year, and created within otherwise desert kind of climate and landscape a rich, very rich alluvial plain that everybody could make a living in. But because it also flowed every year, I mean overflowed every year, it meant that you have an interesting combination of things which are very, very long lived, right? And that are built kind of, if you notice, outside of the alluvial plain. And then you lived closer by, right? Where you did your farming and everything. And those were little common huts, etc., that people lived in that pretty much were washed away every year. So you didn't build exactly, you know, speaking of this individuality that Nancy was talking about, if you lived in Egypt, you did not generally build anything monumental for yourself, right? The individuals would have had their homes wiped out almost every year. So they just built you know, and the climate was pretty nice, so they could live without having a lot of protection. And then as it develops into a big empire over time, then the big monuments, you can kind of see them, are outside of that plain. Because otherwise they will be, and they built some in the wrong places and they got flooded, you know, washed away. But on the whole, so all the monuments and all the things that we think of when we think of Egypt were built well into the time when, where did my cursor go? Into the time when we would have to say that the cultures were developing into big hierarchical cultures. And those same hierarchical cultures still had gods and goddesses. They were polytheistic. And that made for the length of their time of surviving. Because one of the great advantages of polytheism is that when you conquer another little area, say maybe around up here, and you want to take those people in, and you can marry their gods to your goddesses or their goddesses to your god, and you can form a bond that that then you might be under their thumb, but you're not completely under their thumb because you have been made a part of. So this is something which we're going to see as we move along in the big difference between monotheism and polytheism, where I would suggest that polytheism is much more likely to create amity and long-term, you know, consequences of a society not being torn apart, because you can put the people together, which is kind of like the sacred marriage, right? You put the people together, or you put the gods and goddesses together, or you allow both, you just take them in. Once you come to the notion that there is one God, then we're going to have a lot more trouble because you're either right or wrong, right? Your God is either the God or your God is, and that does happen in Egypt, and we will get to that pretty quickly. Okay, so geography creates a very conservative, long, stable community where religion, and here's another thing, religion and politics, they did have politics, etc., but they were one. They were all one. I can't find my cursor again. Where are you? There you are. Okay, so I want to go. Interestingly, they also blended the animal world and the human world. And many of the gods and goddesses were symbolized by like the head of a crocodile or a lion and the body of a human. And it wasn't that they really thought that this happened necessarily literally. So we find that Egyptians are already fairly sophisticated about the idea of symbology. And, they come into the time we're talking about fairly late. We're talking about 3000 BC, 4000 BC. That's obviously not late to us, but it was in comparison to what we've been looking at so far. So the Egyptians developed, at least in their politics, fairly early on, a patriarchy. And when the upper and lower Egypt were unified into one society, they had a clear class system. It still involved women, and women were still significant in it, but they were not the head of the political arena, though they were very significant as, as goddesses. So, where is this thing? Come on, baby. Here we go. There's no female word for pharaoh, okay? So the leader in Egypt was already a male when we start coming. But there are lots of very powerful goddesses to whom the leader was beholden and needed to try to follow their room. And this is Nut. And Nut is the old one. She was the creator of the universe. So Nut is still a representative of the time when it was one. Life, death, life, the great mother. And it was said of Nut, I am what is, what will be, and what has been. No one uncovered me. The fruit to which I give birth was the sun. So she's the old goddess, the old mother goddess, which is then taken into the pantheon of the Egyptians. The pharaoh was a god on earth, but he was expected to be the exemplar of Ma'at, which is the goddess of justice and of order. So the pharaoh needed to represent the goddess of order and justice. That was his job. The eternal life was very important to the Egyptians and particularly to the pharaohs. And that's one of the reasons we end up with all those phenomenal pyramids and huge building projects, because they were often tombs, or they were set up to be a way that the pharaoh's life could go on. And all the wonderful hieroglyphs that most of you are probably at least familiar with their existence. You can see them here in the background of Nut. All of these were symbols of the pantheon that the pharaoh bowed to, and they were male and female. When he died, it was very important to his eternal life that the pharaoh's heart would be weighed against a feather. So that meant he had to, of course, have no guilt, right? No psychological demons, no nothing. He needed to behave himself. So there's a lot of justice in this highly patriarchal world. The goddesses came in, and they mingled with the people. They mingled the people with local deities. So as the Egyptians grew, right, along the Nile, and after, certainly after the unification of the Nile, along that, the local deities like Ba'as, the cat goddess. Remember that picture we saw of one of the earlier goddesses with the cat on her head? This wasn't Egyptian, but the cats and the snakes were also highly symbolic. And Ba'as was one of the local goddesses of one of the areas that was subsumed into Egypt, and they just took her in with them. There was also Nekep, the vulture goddess of the south. And that was united with Was, the cobra goddess of the north. So when they became, let me see if I can move on here. Oh, I know. Okay, I'm going ahead of myself here. But anyway, let me go back. Oh, come on. There we go. So a lot of these are in here. When Upper and Lower Egypt were united, the crown of the pharaoh, and you've probably seen some of these, had both the vulture goddess and the cobra goddess. So the goddess, and it meant the goddess was, the goddesses in this case, were the uniting force that were looking over and after and taking care of the pharaoh. Okay, yeah. Come on, you. The main god of the pharaohs was Ammon, the sun. And you will see the sun in lots of the headdresses, right, of the various pharaohs. This one is about Hathor, the cow goddess. And you can see that. We'll also see it when we see the pictures of the reigning queens and kings, because this is the goddess plus the god, right? So you have the bull's horns and you have the sun. And you'll see this all throughout many of the goddesses. This one is Hathor. I don't have one of Ta'urt, but you've probably seen it if you've seen, Egyptian statues and stuff. Ta'urt protected childbirth, and she's shown as a hippo who's very pregnant, standing up straight, with this nice big straight belly. So we still have the goddess and the fertility, the fecundity. Those themes are still very much a part, even in highly patriarchal Egypt. And then, of course, we have Isis, probably the most famous throughout the ancient world. And you'll find Isis in lots of other cultures besides just the Egyptians. She was the wife and the mother of the dying god. So we have the rituals again going on in Egypt. Osiris was both her child and her husband, and he died. He was, the sacrificial god. All classes of Egyptians worship this duo, Isis and Osiris. Now, the priestesses declined over time from 61 major offices to 0 by the 18th dynasty of the New Kingdom. So instead of having, but in the beginning, early on in Egypt, along with these goddesses came their priestesses, and there were major rituals and major offices that were part of the overall ruling group in Egypt. Egypt practiced both the sacred marriage and the dying god. They were much concerned with the afterlife, and grave goods show they were early adopters of symbolic sacrifice and symbols of helpers to aid the pharaoh in his return. So now one of the questions that was raised, well, what about this human sacrifice? And, what happened? Well, as time goes by, again, because remember, the human sacrifice in most of these early things was the dying king, right? The dying god king, the holy one. And so as societies became more in need of warriors, some of the kings managed to transfer themselves and demand a substitute. So then we end up going from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice. And or possibly another male was sacrificed, right, might be chosen. It evolved. But one of the things that the Egyptians were very good at was recognizing that you didn't have to do everything like this literally, right? You didn't have to go out into the village and find yourself a young man to be the husband and then sacrifice him, now that we've got the king trying to find a way to stay living on. And so they went to symbology rather than the literal fairly early on it didn't mean that they didn't still have, you know, violence and dominance and such, but they did it more in terms of symbols. And of course, the first change was moving to animal sacrifice. So they said, you know, then the original animal sacrifice was the bull, right, or the ram without blemish, which was also, and of course, sheep and rams and bulls, they're the dominant king, right, of the herd. And then they had aids and lots of, but they really did think that life was pretty good in Egypt, at least for the upper classes. And so they wanted, when they came back, their notion of coming back was coming back like they were. So that's part of the reason that the wonderful grave goods that have made it possible for us to study stuff that's been dead for thousands of years is because they literally, you know, tried to remember. You probably saw how many of you saw the King Tut exhibit, which showed part of the things that they found in Tut's tomb? Well, you know, it was loaded with golden chairs to sit on and boats to ride, you know, take you over the river to the new life, etc. So that was a wonderful thing for getting rid of some of the violence, right, and the blood violence. So politics in Egypt was certainly patriarchal. There is a wide variance, though, over the 3,000 years. There were 3 major kingdoms that came and went over hundreds of years. And one of the reasons, though, that they were able to keep going, I think, and stay so stable, is that they combined patriarchy with matrilineal. So, and polygamy also contributes to the stability. There's a lot of the fighting, if you think about modern Europe and other things, is over who's going to succeed the pharaoh. And, you know, what if the pharaoh dies too young, or he hasn't got an obvious heir, or is it going to be the direct heir or the brother of the heir, etc. But in polygamy, then all that had to happen was, in order for them to be accepted, right, as a pharaoh, was that the great wife, who was born of a god and thus of particular import, so there was one woman who was more important, right, more significant than the rest of the women. They had harems, right, full of women, but the great wife was seen as born of God. Ammon, the sun god, consorts with the great wife to bring forth either the next pharaoh or the wife of the next pharaoh. So if the pharaoh and the great wife have a child, then the line goes on, and it doesn't have to be a male child, right? The person who's going to be the next pharaoh is either the one who's born to the great wife as a male, or married to the daughter of the son, the great wife. So there's a lot of greater possibility for keeping a lineage going. They still had battles and wars and 3 different, you know, total regime changes, but that's over a couple thousand years, not too shabby. We should have it so stable. The pharaoh was married to the daughter of the previous pharaoh and his great wife. This led to intermarriage, usually between half relatives or quarter relatives. It's rare, but it did happen that a pharaoh might marry his sister or daughter, even, as in the case of Ramses. That's very late, right, in the New Kingdom, so that's not in the early period. Egyptian women were not equal, but they did have more respect and freedom than most women of their time, and many of the women of later times. Because power went through the religion and family instead of sexual power. The Old and Middle Kingdoms were very conservative, but they were not veiled and they were not hidden. Women weren't put away because there was lots of them. In some ways, this is one of the advantages of a harem, you know, is that you don't have to necessarily totally guard the sexuality, the virginity, the, you know, perfection of this one personal important woman, your wife. The mother was highly respected, and there's a wonderful papyri that shows that advice is given to a young man, and that when he's, you know, of age, and it tells him that he should respect his wife and treat her like he would his mother, who gave birth to him and took care of him even though his stink was foul, and his, you know, and he demanded beer and bread in her house, and still she put it for him. So in other words, look what your mother did for you. Now treat your wife nicely because of that. There was known to have family limitation. It was known and used. They had a goat's bladder, they had diaphragms, they even had spermicides, which were boiled acacia leaves. And I thought that was pretty interesting because modern scientists have discovered that when you boil acacia leaves, you get the same chemical that is in delphin foam and some of those other, you know, controlling of your family things. They also wore diaphanous gowns and nudity, not in the servants, not until though the New Kingdom. So when it became, in other words, in the later part of the Egyptian society, when they were engaged with all kinds of people from all over the ancient world, women being sexy and showing off their bodies was more significant. It was a perfectly holy, decent thing to do, but it was more common. And of course, they were able to make finer linens and the kinds of things. So that was also a status thing. It showed your status. Diaphanous gowns, you know, showed you had a lot of money that you could afford to make, you know, not rough old linens. Ever made linens out of the papyri? Okay, there were some queens of note, and here we have Queen T. Queen T was Amenhotep III's beloved, beautiful wife. And you can see she was Nubian princess here. And she was adored by her husband, and he built her huge monuments, a great pleasure lake, temples and scarabs, all kinds of information we have about Queen T. She thought she was beautiful. Some think she was Asian. I'll leave that to you. There's a lot of, this is a real Egyptian, you know, from that time, picture of her, or not picture, but statuary of her. Another very beautiful princess thought to be maybe Asian was Nefertiti, and she was married to T's son, known for her beauty far and wide. She bore him 6 sons, and then she disappeared, and we have no idea what happened. She might have died in childbirth. She might have, you know, gone out of favor. We don't know. She's one of those great mystery women of the now, her husband changed his name to Akhenaton and tried to introduce monotheism into Egypt, but it only lasted as long as his lifetime, because the priests, the priestesses, they were not about to be thrown out and gotten rid of once he was gone, and so they quickly reverted after his death. The most famous woman was for very, very many centuries thought to be a myth. Surely she didn't exist. It was just unthinkable that there would be a woman who sat on the throne of Egypt, but Hatshepsut did. She actually reigned as pharaoh, and she thought she had a great military and a daring consciousness, and she was the daughter, she was the great wife of Tutmosis I and his great wife. So, and so when he died, there was an heir, but he was just a little kid. And so she became the regent. And as regent, she just shuttled him aside. He had to have a good education. She sent him off to what was equivalent to the military academy. And she had a daughter, Nefertiti. Okay, so as the queen regent for little Tutmosis and his great wife, of course he was already pledged to marry Nefertiti, she ruled. Now, she is buried in the Valley of the Kings. She had noble and priestly support. That's how she was able to rule, of course, without which she could not have ruled. Here, now we know, is her temple, and you can see that it's a very different style than most of the monuments that we are familiar with in Egypt. It has much more balance, great grandeur. And of course, how did she do this? You know? Well, remember that there is mysticism as well as practicality. And in a world like Egypt, nobody or very, very few people really ever saw the actual pharaohs, right? They would have seen all kinds of statues of them. They would have seen priests representing them, etc. But she said that she put out in propaganda that the great God had perfumed her with his mighty dew, Ammon, right, the god of the pharaohs, and turned her into a man. Now, obviously, she couldn't get by with this without palace support, right? But she was considered to be a really fine building pharaoh. She put the people to work. She did lots of good works. There was jobs, there was prosperity, there was peace. So there was no big fighting during her time. And instead of fighting, they had trade. So one of the things that she eulogizes and shows off is the trip to Punt. And in that trip to Punt, oops, I thought I had a picture of it, sorry. The Punt expedition, you'll find among the things they finally found, once they found that Hatshepsut really existed, on her mortuary temple here and elsewhere, all these pictures of the trip to Punt. And Punt was a very, very rich African nation. And so from that, lots of goods, lots of trade, and lots of good propaganda. She saw and rewarded talent. And finally, at the very end, she was overthrown by Moses III, who by that time was in his 30s and furious to have been kept out of his job for a very long time. It's interesting, though, that she was not murdered, and he had not been murdered. So even though she took over his job and sent him off, you know, to be educated and then kept him kind of away from the seats of power and in the army, she did not do him in, and she could have easily. Obviously, she had all that power, but no, she had a respect for the future of the country, and he became one of the greatest of the pharaohs of the New Kingdom. However, he did. I'm going to go backwards here. He did throw a good hissy fit once he was in power and destroyed her monuments and tried to rub her out of history, which is one of the reasons that we didn't know about her until the very modern era. And archaeologists began to, you know, discover stuff that they had never had there before. And he literally had her monuments hacked to pieces and took her name and had it cut out, you know, of all these, of the tombs, etc. But, you know, they knew about that. They wanted to be known for eternity. And so there were places where it was hidden by her architects and little areas which were finally turned up in the modern era that proved that she actually was not a myth or a story or a lying legend. And now, of course, she's very famous, and you can go visit a lot of the things that are attributed, like her mortuary temple. And it's a very beautiful thing to see. Okay, her mummy is lost, but she lived, we do know that she lived from the writings and the hieroglyphs, at least 5 years after the restoration. So he didn't come in and kill her. He just tried to rub her out of history after she died, probably. We don't know that for sure. It's pretty hard to tell. Okay, I'm going to move on to Crete, but before I do that, are there any questions some of you might have about Egypt that you'd like to ask? No? Okay. Well, in that case, I'm going to, oops, I don't want to do that. Escape. I'm going to escape. Good. I'm going to escape, and I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going back here. How we doing? Have you got a swirl?
Yes.
Okay. Is that on your full screen or how is it? You see me and 2 screens or?
2 screens.
Okay. Now what do you see?
2 screens.
You see 2 screens?
No, it's fine. It's a full screen of your swirl.
Yeah.
Thank you.
2 full screens.
Okay. Good. Okay, there we go. Okay, I'm going to move on to Crete. And actually to the misnamed Minoans. Okay. The Minoans were named by Arthur Evans when they discovered the phenomenal, beautiful and very old world of Crete that had been destroyed. And he discovered that in 1899. And of course, again, remember, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. And in the case of Arthur Evans, of course, when he found Old Crete, which Old Crete, the time we're talking about, is 3000 BC to 1500 BCE. And about 1500, there is an abrupt description of it. And after that, 50 years after that, Crete is invaded by the Mycenaeans, who were Greeks, okay, Greeks and Trojans, etc. So that would have been the milieu or the environment that Evans was in his archaeology. And so he assumed when he found this highly advanced civilization in Knossos that then it must be the ancient Minoans that were spoken about, right, in the works of the later Greeks. But in fact, it was wrong, because he called it after Knossos because of the bull cult and the Greek legends attributed to Homer, of course. So we know about the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they assumed that this was what he was talking about. So the other thing about let's see if I've got a picture of right now. Okay, there's the bull cult. This is one of the things they found. They found wonderful artifacts in Crete. And this is, it actually looks, I've seen it, it actually looks like this. I mean, you know, they've cleaned it up, obviously, but it's quite amazing, and it's got tattoos all over its face. They also had fabulous frescoes that they discovered. And among these were some of these bull leaping pictures, these wonderful bull leaping pictures. And like other ancient peoples, well, I'm going to call them by what they should be called. The Castorites is what they called themselves. That's since been discovered, you know, long after Arthur Evans. But they colored sex by color. See, you know, so you can see here that this is a guy leaping over, and these are females holding onto the bull. Okay. And you can imagine, well, what he thought was, oh my God, this must have been where Theseus was sent, you know, to, remember Theseus and the bull, the Minotaur? Those were the things he was thinking of when he named these folks the Minoans. You're familiar with Theseus and the Minotaur, right? The story of Theseus? No? Okay. It's in the Homer's, you know, the stories. Theseus was a hero, right? He's one of the great Greek heroes. So when we get to the not modern, but, you know, modern compared to what we are in here, you know, the Greeks that we think of when we talk about the Greeks, Athens and Sparta, and that's 400 BC. This is 1500 to 3000 BC. But the story was of the great, Theseus was one of the great Greek heroes, and this organization, this other place, required that who was running the Aegean at that time, and that required, of course, sacrifices. And since Theseus was a noble prince, he volunteered. This is kind of another thing you're questioning there about why would a person volunteer to sacrifice himself? Well, that's part of being a noble prince, right? And he volunteered to go instead of just, you know, sending any old guy. And he managed to, he would be put into the lair of the Minotaur, right? He would be put and he would die. They would be strange. A Minotaur is half man, half bull. Does that sound kind of like the Egyptians? You know? So the Cretans are far more like Egyptians than they are actually like Greeks. So that's why they're misnamed, right? That's why we now know they called themselves the Caphtorites. You know, and we also find the Caphtorites in the Old Testament. So in that earlier period, we can find a few references have been found now, a few references to these people. So you'll think of them as Minoans. It's still very much out there. You know, it's hard to get people to realize that the Caphtorites and the Minoans were the same people, but they weren't Minoans, you know, but because it's had a long history now since Arthur Evans of calling them Minoans. But it's wrong. But anyway, that's how it goes. You know, once you get yourself into the history books, it tends to stay there for a long time. Anyway, what happened to Theseus was that he managed to charm one of the local women, and she told him that the way he could get out, the reason he could not get out and it was bound to be eaten by or killed by or whatever, the Minotaur, is because it was in a labyrinth, right? It was a big, long, hard place to get into. I think I'm going to answer the question that you asked before, one of you asked before with this, and if not, you can ask me when we get to it. But anyway, the Minotaur lived in the center of the labyrinth, and these sacrificial young men were sent there. And of course, they would wander around in the labyrinth. They could never get out, and eventually the Minotaur would kill them. And so that was the sacrifice, right, of the dying king. And so what he saw and what he found in Crete made him think this looks a lot like a labyrinth, because the palace there that he called Knossos is multi-layered, highly sophisticated, and has room after room after room, you know, underneath and then above. It had running water and working toilets, not the toilets like we have them, but that, you know, you could, in the centers of the thing, they had water that could be run through and out, and you know, and out. So it was very sophisticated, and he thought, of course, from pictures like this, oh, this must have been how they really sacrificed them, right? The bull cult. And this is by the way, where is that? Where's my? Come on here. This has been proved to be a very sophisticated calendar here as well. So this is one of the many, many wonderful frescoes that they found and have been rebuilt. As you can see, the part that's painted here is rebuilt, and then these are the real pieces. Anyway, that's the mistake he made, and it's stuck with us for a long time. What refutes his assessment was that they've discovered the Phaistos disc. One of those. No, oh, no, that's not where I want to go. Just a second. Okay. Sorry, I have to stop my share and go to the other place. I want to share my screen, and I want to share this one.
Could I also ask you to spell Caphtorite, because I can't find this online?
Oh, sure. It's CAPHTORITE.
Thank you. It's PH.
I think
That's
so.
the only one I'm not finding.
Okay. Okay, now.
Good.
Okay. Good. Okay, here we are. So here is where we were. Okay, the goddess Crete and the bull leaping. This is the Phaistos disc. This was also discovered there, and as you can see, it was, nobody could. There wasn't very much else written, and for many years, and actually into the time when I was studying this, it was unreadable. They couldn't figure it out. And they decide, you can see it runs like this, right? The story. The symbols are pictographs. And so they're much closer to Egyptian hieroglyphs than they are to, but they also are a labyrinth, right? So you can walk this labyrinth. And finally, they figured out that linear A, there were two linears, linear A and linear B, that linear A is some form of very, very archaic Greek. So that may come from the Mycenaean period after, after they conquered Crete. But when we look at Caphtorite civilization, the art is very different. It's very different from Greek art. It's different from Egyptian art. It's quite unique of its own. And here's an example. This is an octopus jar. And look how beautiful it is. It's flowing, it's nature focused. And here's one of the things I love about it. There are no war scenes at all. So everything they've discovered from the digs at, well, Minos in Crete, they have beautiful gold work. These cups have pictures on them. I don't know if you can see it right here, but it's like everything in Cretan art is flowing and moving and non-geometric. It's the opposite of the pyramids, even though they're, the buildings are great. It's more like a labyrinth. It's more like, I love this piece. This is a little gold piece. It's, I got a copy of it. Of course, you can get them all over Crete if you're willing to pay for the gold. Anyway, it's about 2 inches, 2 inches. Look how fine it is, about 2 inch square. It was a very advanced civilization with no weapons of war for over 1,000 years. Now, maybe it was their convenient spot in the middle of, the Mediterranean there. Maybe there were protection, but they don't even have pictures of them on their artwork. Here is the goddess. The goddess that you saw, the bare-breasted goddess, is from Crete with a wasp waist. And here you can see, again, this is in a ring. This is like a seal ring. You know how they would send things and stamp them with wax or whatever and stamp them with seal. There are all kinds of seals that they found that are small, maybe 1.5 inches or so, but highly detailed, like this ring. There is a bull cult in Crete, and but the bull, and we'll find that again when we get to the Old Testament, is the bull is not the god, he's the consort of the goddess. And there are the sacrifice of the bull. Here we see, this is another one of the Cretes. Here you can see the symbolic, right? The movement on here's the priestesses, white, right? A musician, male, in red. And here we have the trussed up bull. And he is being sacrificed along with possibly other potential sacrifices. So they practice sacrifice, it would appear, but they don't practice human sacrifice. We have no evidence of human sacrifice. There is one thing, the National Geographic came out with it, I don't know, many, many years ago, but that may indicate that they once practiced human sacrifice. And it's dated, it's in a place called Amenosphelia. It's out in Crete. My husband and I got lost 3 or 4 times trying to find the place. It's just a very small place, but it was a dig, and there is some evidence that maybe there was a human sacrifice being prepared. It's at the very end of the Cretan hegemony in that 1500 period. 1500, there appears to have been what we think are huge earthquakes about then. Santorini has been explored at that same time, you know, with a possible blow up. And, but anyway, there was great peril somewhere around 1500 because the Minoan or Caphtorite civilization disintegrated before it was invaded 50 years later by the Mycenaeans. And so there's a huge break. You can really see the break in the archaeology. And in Ammonophilia, they did discover at that period of time, right, during the period, if there was there might have been a lot of earthquakes and, you know, floods, et cetera, that happened. We don't really know what destroyed Crete, but the civilization, I mean, this highly advanced civilization. But about 1500 in Santorini, there was a big earthquake that we know of, and that is nearby, right, in the city. And it might well have been that there were earthquakes throughout that place because Ammonophilia, of course, was down in rubble. And when they dug it up, they found they found a young male in a position similar to this bull, you know, in a kind of a fetal position. And then they found what they termed a priest and a priestess wearing rings. You know, that's why they determined they were priest and priestess there. And according to what I read, the body of the young male was half, I think this is right, half black and half white, and that's what happens when, you know, there's a fire and such, and the body was half drained of its blood. And so it was probably being sacrificed. My guess, again, that's one of those things, well, you know, you could look into that. It's kind of fascinating, and I haven't read about it lately, so maybe there's more that's been done. But what we know from the pictures in Crete, from all of the, you know, things that were dug up and like this one, they were not practicing human sacrifice well before then. Maybe things were so bad that they reverted, you know, but the sacrifice of the bull or of the dying king, those rituals could still have existed in that period of time in Crete as well. So I'm going to leave that one to you to figure out, you know, if it's possible. I don't know, but that's one of the questions that has been asked of this information. And I'm going to drop that now here into your lap. We're not going to move on to the Mycenaeans because that's next time. Usually I connect them to the Greeks, and we're done with the lecture for now. Okay.
Yay.
We are back. Hi. Good to see you all. Oh my goodness, almost right on time. I hope you'll come back for next time. Next week we'll look at the Greeks and maybe the Christians. I haven't laid it all out yet.
Marianne, you have a question, but unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. No, we can't hear you. You have to unmute yourself, Marianne. No, you're still muted.
Okay.
Down to the lower left. Oh, there you are. Good.
You mentioned that it was the Caphtorites who were talked about in the Old Testament. What reference was used to talk about them?
You know what? I don't know the answer to that. I read about it. I didn't read it.
Okay.
Actually.
Okay.
Gunther?
Yeah, you know, I remember from school that the Minoans, there were predominantly women were ruling the society at that time, right?
That's true. And that was one of the things that Arthur Evans noticed.
Yeah.
But he just misnamed them, you know. Yeah, that's the female
and peaceful
presence is all over Crete. It's a wonderful place to go if you go to, you know, visit.
Okay. Mickey, are you trying to ask a question? You've got to unmute yourself.
I was just trying to say thank you. I can't figure out how to make a comment in writing. So thank you.
You're so welcome. Thank you for coming.
Yep.
All right. Okay. Any others? Okay. So a week from now, 10 o'clock, Thursday. We will have part 2.
Sounds good.
Thank you so much for coming, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Really like seeing y'all.
Okay.
I hope to see you next week.
You will.
Bill.